My name is Barbara Lee. I'm the president of the Princeton Adult School. I want to welcome you to a new venue tonight. Congratulations, you all found it. Next week, we'll be back at the Friends Auditorium. We weren't able to use that venue tonight. There was another group using it, but we'll be back there next week, so please don't come here next week. It's my great privilege to introduce Randall Balmer to you tonight. He's a prize-winning historian and Emmy Award nominee. Randall Balmer is professor of American Religious History at Barnard College, and he's also a visiting professor this semester at Dartmouth College. He's also visited at Princeton, Rutgers, Drew, and Northwestern universities. He's an adjunct professor of church history at Union Theological Seminary, and he's an Episcopal priest, a practicing Episcopal priest. His commentaries on religion in America have appeared in newspapers across the country, including the New York Times and a number of other newspapers. He's the author of a dozen books, including Thy Kingdom Come, How the Religious Right Distorts the Faith and Threatens America, and Mine Eyes Have Seen the Glory, A Journey into the Evangelical Subculture in America, now in its fourth edition, which has been made into a three-part documentary for the public broadcasting system. His most recent book, I have a visual aid here, is God in the White House, A History, How Faith Shaped the Presidency from John F. Kennedy to George W. Bush. Professor Balmer, as I said, is an Episcopal priest. He received his PhD from Princeton. He's a student of John Wilson, who you'll be hearing from next week. So that's a nice transition to a different generation here. His title tonight is Where Have All the Baptists Gone? Church and State at the Turn of the 21st Century. Please help me welcome Professor Randall Balmer.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you for that nice welcome. It's great to be back in Princeton. I was here from 1980 to 1985. In many ways, 5 of the happiest years of my life. I really enjoyed it. I loved it here, and much of that is due to my wonderful mentor, John Wilson, from whom you'll hear next week. I want to talk tonight a little bit about the religious right, the rise of the religious right, the circumstances surrounding the religious right, and the various issues that have been identified by leaders of the religious right as the salient issues for our particular political moment, and also to talk about the issue of church and state. And the title, Where Have All the Baptists Gone, suggests that leaders of the religious right, many of whom claim to be Baptists, are, in my judgment, not really Baptists, but I'll get into that a little bit later. I want to set it up by talking about evangelicalism in America, particularly in the 20th century, as a way of understanding the circumstances surrounding the rise of the religious right. With some contrivance, and I confess there is some contrivance here, I think it's possible to divide the 20th century into 4 relatively equal 25-year periods and talk about the attitude or the posture of evangelicals toward the larger culture in each of those quadrants of the 20th century. From the turn of the 20th century to 1925, I would characterize as a time of suspicion on the part of evangelicals toward the larger culture. This has to do with a lot of things that were happening in American society, but particularly 2 intellectual currents from the 19th century that were just beginning to make their presence felt among evangelicals in the 20th century. First would be Darwinism, of course, The Origin of Species, which was published way back in 1859, but whose effects, I think, really were blunted by the onset of the Civil War. And it wasn't until the turn of the 20th century that evangelicals began to consider the ramifications of Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, particularly as it related to the scriptures and the Bible, the authenticity, or the reliability, rather, of the scriptures, particularly the Genesis account of creation. This was particularly important, the issue of the Bible was particularly important to evangelicals because one of the characteristics of evangelicalism is a strong, firm reliance on the Bible. Part of the Protestant Reformation, of course, on the part of Martin Luther in the 16th century was to undermine or to discount the second basis for authority in the Roman Catholic Church, that is tradition or the interpretation of the church, and rely simply on sola scriptura. In Luther's words, the Bible alone is the source of authority. So any assault on the credibility or the reliability of the Bible was seen and viewed with a great deal of seriousness by evangelicals. So Darwin's ideas, of course, taken to their logical extreme, undermine traditional interpretations of the scriptures and literalistic interpretations of the book of Genesis. The second intellectual current from Europe was the German discipline of higher criticism, which again cast doubt upon the authenticity or the reliability of the scriptures by suggesting, for example, that maybe Moses himself did not write all the 5 books of the Torah or the Pentateuch in the Hebrew Bible. For example, how does Moses at the end of Deuteronomy record his own death? That's a pretty basic question that a lot of these higher critics sought to answer, but also cast doubt or suspicion on other dimensions of the Bible and its reliability. And so during this first quarter of the 20th century, you have a growing suspicion about what's going on, particularly in intellectual centers. You also have the advent of what is called modernism or theological liberalism in American mainline Protestant denominations, and many evangelicals who are much more conservative theologically, politically as well, but we'll get into that later, much more conservative theologically begin to grow increasingly suspicious of what's going on in the larger culture. This is also the era, by the way, when you have the publication of the Fundamentals, which is a series of 12 pamphlets or booklets published between 1910 and 1915, which articulated a very conservative Orthodox approach to Protestant theology. Affirming, for example, the virgin birth of Jesus, the historicity of the resurrection, the authenticity of miracles, the inerrancy of the Bible, and so forth. These were the doctrines that were elucidated in these fundamentals, and those people who subscribed to these doctrines, of course, came to be known as fundamentalists, and this is where we get the term, even though it's been expanded more broadly to talk about, say, Hindu fundamentalism and Jewish fundamentalism and Islamic fundamentalism and so forth. It comes from this series of pamphlets that appeared between 1910 and 1915. So this is an era of suspicion on the part of evangelicals toward the larger culture. The second quarter of the 20th century I would characterize as a time of separation, when evangelicals begin to remove themselves from the larger culture. And here I would point to the pivotal moment, symbolic certainly, but I think also important, and that would be the Scopes trial in Dayton, Tennessee in July of 1925, when William Jennings Bryan squared off against Clarence Darrow in the Rea County Courthouse down there in Dayton. The consequence of the Scopes trial was to convince American evangelicals, at least many of them, certainly most of them probably, that the larger culture had definitively turned against them. It was no longer safe. And during this second quarter of the 20th century, evangelicals began to retreat into their own world. They began to construct what I call a subculture, this vast and interlocking network of congregations, denominations, publishing houses, missionary societies, Bible camps, Bible institutes, seminaries, and so forth, that were constructed as a kind of refuge, a kind of fortress against what evangelicals came increasingly to regard as the depredations and the corruptions of the larger cultures. It was a defensive measure. And so evangelicals began to retreat into that world in the second quarter of the 20th century and began to construct their own institutions. These were places of refuge, and I can attest to this personally. It was possible to grow up in the middle decades of the 20th century within this world, within this subculture, and have very, very little commerce with anyone outside of that world. It was almost a hermetically sealed universe for many evangelicals that was this place of refuge and retreat from the larger culture. And that, I think, really characterizes especially the second quarter of the 20th century. If I were to look for a transitional moment for the third quarter of the 20th century, I'd probably point to Billy Graham's crusade in Portland, Oregon in 1950. Billy Graham was at the beginning of his career at that point. He had spent several years as a revivalist and evangelist for Youth for Christ, decided to strike out on his own. And it was during the Portland crusade in 1950 where he became persuaded to go on the radio with his radio program called Hour of Decision, and also to incorporate as the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, which was an entirely new approach to evangelism. But Billy Graham, and throughout his career and even to this day, Billy Graham was remarkable for his willingness and his ability to engage the larger culture. And I think the genius of evangelicalism, I would argue throughout American history, although I'm not going to get into that too much tonight, but throughout American history, evangelicals have been extraordinarily adept at speaking the idiom of the culture, no matter where they are. And Billy Graham, I think, exemplifies that, the ability to move easily within this larger world. So Billy Graham, early in his career, makes a very conscious decision to reject the narrow, sectarian, separatist fundamentalism of his childhood in favor of a broader, more inclusive evangelicalism, sometimes called neo-evangelicalism or new evangelicalism, beginning, I think, around 1950 with his Portland, Oregon crusade. So evangelicals in this third quarter of the 20th century are beginning to re-engage with the culture, albeit cautiously, I do have to point that out, but to re-engage with what's going on in the larger society from roughly 1950 to 1975. Let me give you another example of that. Speaking of the idiom of the culture, one of my favorite examples is Robert Schuller, the guy you see on television from Garden Grove, California, and we could have probably a long theological discussion about whether or not he's really an evangelical and theologically, but in terms of his marketing skills, he very much fits that mold. Robert Schuller was a pastor in a denomination called the Reformed Church of America, which goes back historically to the Dutch Reformed Church in the colonial era. Reformed Church of America in Illinois, a very small congregation. And in 1955, he accepted what was essentially a missionary posting to Orange County, California. So he goes out to Orange County, California in 1955. He figures out almost immediately that this is an automobile culture. So what does he do? It's brilliant. He rents the Orange Drive-In Theater on Chapman Avenue in Orange, California. It's still there, at least last time I was in the area, it was still there. And he distributes handbills throughout the entire region, inviting people to come as they are in the family car. Perches himself on top of the concession stands and preaches to the headlights. Now, it may not be much for building community, or it may not be much in terms of a church, in terms of any sort of theological substance to it, but it's brilliant marketing. And this is an example of how evangelicals are re-engaging the culture and learning how to speak the language of the culture. One further example, and it's actually a kind of a lineal descendant of Robert Schuller, and that is a megachurch some of you perhaps have heard about in South Barrington, Illinois, called Willow Creek Community Church, begun in 1975, actually. It was begun by a college student by the name of Bill Hybels, who wanted to start a church in the northwest suburbs of Chicago. And his first step, after, by the way, consulting with Robert Schuller, although he doesn't like to advertise that fact anymore, his first step toward starting this new church was to conduct a door-to-door market research survey to find out why suburbanites were staying away from church. And on the basis of that survey, the results of that survey, he proceeded then to design a church. That phrase always strikes me, especially as an Episcopal priest, I guess. Design a church that would overcome their objections. For example, he found that people, of course, didn't like to be done for money when they went to church. So if you go to Willow Creek today, there will be an announcement at the offering time that people who are visiting should consider themselves guests and not feel obliged to contribute anything to the offering basket as it comes around. He found out that people were put off by religious symbols. So if you go to Willow Creek Community Church, There's nothing in the architecture or in the decor that would suggest it's a church. No crosses, no religious symbols, nothing whatsoever. It looks like a corporate office park. In fact, there's a pond out in front with a fountain and geese swimming around the pond, pond and so forth. He found out that the people wanted to remain anonymous when they went to church, at least for the first time, so they don't introduce themselves as they might in other venues, evangelical churches. Today, Willow Creek Community Church draws about 22,000 people every weekend to its services on Saturday night and Sunday. It's a huge operation and in many ways kind of the prototype for the megachurch, although I think the notion goes all the way back to the 1920s with Aimee Semple McPherson. Bill Hybels and Willow Creek has kind of perfected that model. But again, speaking the language of the culture, and evangelicals are learning to do that with increased clarity, I think, in the third quarter of the 20th century. And if I were to look for a transition moment for the fourth quarter of the 20th century, I'd probably point to the presidential campaign of Jimmy Carter in 1975 and 1976. Just before the North Carolina primary, Jimmy Carter let it slip that he was a born-again Christian, thereby sending every journalist in New York to his Rolodex to try to figure out what in the world he was talking about. In fact, Barbara was kind enough to mention God in the White House. One of the things I found in the course of doing research on God in the White House is that one of the network anchormen got on the, I guess, nightly news or whichever one it was, I've forgotten which one it was, and solemnly reassured Americans that they've been looking into this born-again stuff, and it's really not some kind of mountaintops experience. It's actually fairly common, he allowed, especially among Baptists. Trying to reassure Americans about this. But for evangelicals, this represented a kind of coming of age, because evangelicals were beginning to re-engage even further in the culture. Up until that time, many evangelicals did not even vote or even register to vote because they regarded politics as this kind of dirty enterprise, corrupting, there's nothing really to be gained from that. And there was another factor, too, that I probably should mention, I forgot to mention earlier, and that is throughout most of the 20th century, certainly up until 1975, evangelicals were something called premillennialists. And I don't want to get into this in too much detail because it's really a theological discussion. But premillennialists believe that Jesus will return at any time. To be self-referential here for a moment, I grew up within this world, and I remember many sermons about this. You know, you may not make it home before Jesus comes, and whatever it is. And it could be true here for this gathering tonight. You may not make it home, and may not make it through the lecture, or who knows. But that was a constant refrain: is that Jesus is coming at any time, and we should get ready for that. And the background for that, again, without getting into too much detail here, is that in the 19th century, there had been a profound and very important shift in evangelical ideas about the end of the world, or eschatology. In the antebellum period, evangelicals embraced something called post-millennialism. Now, again, I don't want to be too technical, although if you have questions later, I'd be happy to expound on it and bore you all. But essentially, post-millennialists believed that Jesus would return to earth after the millennium, which is the 1,000-year period spoken of or written about in the book of Revelation. A 1,000-year period of righteousness and goodwill here on earth. Now, this had enormous implications, because if you believe that Jesus will return after this millennium, the corollary is that you believe that it's incumbent upon you as a believer to bring about the millennium, this righteous rule on earth. And this, in fact, is what largely animated many of the social reform movements of the antebellum period. Slavery was regarded by certainly northern evangelicals as a scourge, and it had to be eradicated in order to bring about this millennial kingdom. Equal rights for women, by the way, was another very important strain within evangelical thought, because this was the notion of bringing about this millennial kingdom here on earth. Even the temperance movement, which we regard today as a kind of a conservative movement or an oppressive movement, but in the 19th century, many evangelicals approached that saying that this is a way to bring about a more godly world and a more godly kingdom here on earth. What happens is that in the late 19th century, with urbanization, industrialization, the arrival of non-Protestant immigrants, is that evangelicals utterly switched their understanding of eschatology. From post-millennialism, Jesus is coming back after we construct this millennium, to something called premillennialism, and to confuse you further, it's called dispensational premillennialism, but I'm not going to get into that. Jesus is coming at any time. So the corollary is that this absolves us from the whole enterprise of social reform. If Jesus is coming back at any time, we don't have to worry about this world where Jesus is going to come to get us out of this mess, and that'll be the end of it. I like to say about evangelicalism in the 20th century, there are two very profound effects from the evangelical embrace of premillennialism. First is feeling absolved from the whole enterprise of social reform. The second is some very, very bad architecture. And I could show you places, Bible institutes in particular. Cinder blocks do just fine because Jesus is coming back at any moment. Let's not waste our resources or our time on building fancy buildings. No, I'm serious. This is I could give you many, many examples. In fact, I've got a bit of a slideshow that I show my undergraduates sometimes about this, illustrating this. Because Jesus is coming back at any time. So part of that then is just jumping back to the 1970s, and I apologize for skipping around here. Part of what made Carter's campaign so significant is that he begins to lure evangelicals out of their apolitical torpor. And because he's speaking their language, he's speaking the language of being a born-again Christian. And this was just kind of electric to a lot of evangelicals, and I remember this very clearly myself. He begins to lure them back into the political arena after being politically quiescent for the better part of half a century. Jimmy Carter then, of course, as you know, goes on to win the presidency, and it is during the Carter administration that we see the rise of the religious right, which is what gets us finally to the topic at hand. We all know the religious right began as a political movement in opposition to the Roe v. Wade ruling handed down by the Supreme Court on January 22nd, 1973. Up until that time, as I said, evangelicals were largely quiescent politically. They were not engaged in any meaningful, certainly not in any organized way in the political process, but the sheer moral outrage that surrounded the Roe v. Wade ruling is what got them organized and mobilized into a political movement. They even went so far as to characterize themselves as the new abolitionists, trying to draw a moral parallel between their opposition to abortion and the opposition of antebellum evangelicals to the scourge of slavery. That's the story. It's also fiction. The religious right did not galvanize in response to Roe v. Wade. I call this the abortion myth. The abortion myth is that it was the abortion issue that finally brought them into the political arena. The truth is rather more complicated. The religious right did, in fact, respond to was a response to a court decision, but it was not Roe v. Wade in 1973. It was a lower court ruling that was handed down by the District Court of the District of Columbia on June 30th, 1970, called Green v. Connolly. The background for Green v. Connolly, 1971, I believe it is, June 30th, 1971. The background for Green v. Connolly is that by the late 60s, early 70s, the federal government was trying to find ways to extend some of the provisions of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the landmark legislation that Lyndon Johnson pushed through Congress and signed into law on July 2nd, 1964. The Civil Rights Act, of course, forbade racial segregation and racial discrimination. And in doing so, the Internal Revenue Service issued an opinion that said, any organization that engages in racial segregation or racial discrimination is not, by definition, a charitable organization. Therefore, it has no claim on tax-exempt status. So, too, the corollary would be that any contributions from individuals to such organizations no longer qualified for tax exemption. Green v. Connolly upheld the Internal Revenue Service in that opinion. And in the ensuing years, the Internal Revenue Service sought to enforce that provision against the various so-called segregation academies, many of them in the South, that had arisen in response to the Brown v. Board of Education ruling of May 17, 1954. Another school they targeted for enforcement was a fundamentalist school in Greenville, South Carolina, called Bob Jones University, which until 1971 did not admit African Americans to its student body, and until 1975 did not admit unmarried African Americans to its student body. That was the catalyst for the rise of the religious right. It was not abortion. In fact, in 1971, at its meeting at its convention in St. Louis, Missouri, the Southern Baptist Convention passed a resolution, hardly a bastion of liberalism, passed a resolution calling for the legalization of abortion. A resolution that was reaffirmed by the Southern Baptist Convention in 1974 and again in 1976. When the Roe v. Wade ruling was handed down, several prominent evangelical leaders, including notably W.A. Criswell, the redoubtable fundamentalist from Dallas, Texas, pastor of First Baptist Church in Dallas, issued statements applauding the Roe v. Wade ruling as marking an appropriate distinction between personal morality and public policy. You see why I call it the abortion myth. The real catalyst for the religious right was the action against Bob Jones University and similar schools in the mid-1970s. Paul Weyrich, by the way, is one of the witnesses that I will marshal in behalf of this interpretation. According to Weyrich, Weyrich had been a conservative activist going back to the Goldwater campaign in 1964. Very early on, he recognized the potential, the electoral potential of these millions of evangelicals who were not active and certainly not organized politically. And according to Weyrich, he said, I tried everything to get them interested and involved. I tried the school prayer issue. I tried the proposed equal rights amendment to the Constitution. I tried the pornography issue. I tried abortion. Nothing got their attention until the Bob Jones case. That is what motivated and activated evangelical leaders into what became known as the religious right. How did abortion become part of the quotient? According to Weyrich, he told me this directly. After they had mobilized on the Bob Jones case, there was a conference call among these various evangelical ministers and the architects of the religious right. And someone said, we have the makings here of a political movement. What other issues can we address? Several people made suggestions, and finally, according to Weyrich, the voice on the end of one of the lines said, how about abortion? And that is how abortion became part of the political agenda of the religious right. In the late 1970s, in preparation for the 1980 presidential campaign, and not in direct response to Roe v. Wade in January of 1973. This is why I call it the abortion myth. let me add just a caveat to what I said. Well, it's not really a caveat, it's a refinement. I don't think the primary motivation on the part of the architects of the religious right or the leaders of the religious right was racism. And the reason I say that is that I think what they were doing is defending, in their own eyes, they were defending the integrity of this evangelical subculture that I talked about earlier from government interference. Let me, again, be self-referential and give you an example of this. My father was a pastor, a minister in evangelical churches throughout the Midwest. And I remember very often we would have the president of a Bible school or Bible institute come by our church, usually on a Sunday evening. By the way, evangelicals attend church a lot, including Sunday evening, and actually more than that every week. But usually on a Sunday evening. And he would be coming by to raise money, recruit students, and so forth. And he would be talking about the glories of his school. But one of the cornerstones of the appeal was always, we don't accept any money from the federal government, therefore the federal government can't tell us how to run our shop. Who we have to hire or fire, who we admit, who we reject from the student body. It was always a point of pride. We don't accept any federal money from the government, therefore the government leaves us alone. And so when the Internal Revenue Service went after Bob Jones University, that was interpreted by evangelicals as an assault on the insularity and the integrity of this evangelical subculture. So I do want to make that point. Still, I think it's fair to point out the paradox that the very people who go to such pains to style themselves as the new abolitionists actually organized effectively to defend racial segregation and racial discrimination in the Bob Jones case. Just to play out the Bob Jones case here for a moment, as some of you remember, the Bob Jones case went all the way to the Supreme Court in the fall of 1982, at which time the Reagan administration argued on behalf of Bob Jones University that it should be allowed to maintain both its racially discriminatory policies as well as its tax exemption. The decision was handed down from the Supreme Court in May of 1983, 8-1 against Bob Jones University in that case. The sole dissenter, by the way, was Associate Justice William Rehnquist, whom Reagan later elevated to Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. Another twist. The Internal Revenue Service, after years of warnings, finally rescinded the tax exemption of Bob Jones University on January 19th, 1976. As the religious right was gaining momentum later in the 1970s in preparation for the 1980 campaign, one of their complaints about Jimmy Carter was his revocation of the tax exemption at Bob Jones University and his meddling into the affairs of evangelicals, evangelical institutions. Think again about that date I just gave you. January 19th, 1976. Jimmy Carter was still running for the Democratic nomination for president in January 19th, 1976. He did not take office until 1 year and 1 day after the tax exemption was revoked from Bob Jones University. And yet the leaders of the religious right were successful in pinning that action on Jimmy Carter and used that as one of their arguments for his defeat when he ran for re-election in 1980. As I say in this book, talking about that particular incident, Jimmy Carter, as president, was dealt a bad hand, I think, in the late 1970s, and it's a hand that in many ways he played badly. But he was also up against some very fiendishly deceptive people who would do anything to bring him down, as of course they did in 1980. The other thing I find fascinating about the religious right as it puts together its agenda is its peculiar embrace of abortion, which I mentioned earlier. but also its opposition to homosexuality in public policy. And the reason I find that peculiar is that when I was growing up within evangelicalism, and this is not true merely for my own perspective, but more widely ascertainable, the real besetting sin among evangelicals was divorce. Now, this tells too much about me, perhaps, but I'll say it anyway. I remember in the 1960s asking my mother why we as a family were not supporting Nelson Rockefeller I thought that was the important question to ask, but I did anyway. And the answer was clear and unequivocal. We could never vote for a man who had been divorced and remarried. In 1980, however, as evangelicals began to look to Ronald Reagan as their political savior, that issue utterly disappeared. In fact, I went back through the pages of Christianity Today magazine, which is kind of the flagship magazine for evangelicalism, and counted the number of articles in the 1970s opposed to divorce, and then compared it to the number of articles in the 1980s. I forget the exact numbers, but the denunciations of divorce dropped virtually out of sight after 1980 with the embrace of Ronald Reagan, a divorced and remarried man, as President of the United States in 1980, who also, by the way, as many of you remember, in 1967, as governor of California, had signed into law the most liberal abortion bill in the country. So, evangelicals left behind the whole issue of divorce in 1980, and they embraced both abortion and homosexuality, which has always seemed a bit odd to me, particularly the homosexuality issue, well, both of them for that matter, because Jesus says nothing about either one, which I find very interesting. Another quick story. On, I believe it was March 30th, 2005, there was a remarkable photograph on the front page of the New York Times, just below the masthead and above the fold, which was a photograph of an array of religious leaders in Jerusalem, including the heads of the various branches of Judaism, high-ranking official from Eastern Orthodoxy, high-ranking official from the Vatican, somebody else, Islamic leaders as well. And of course, as somebody who studies religion, I was rather interested in this. So I read the caption, and I was trying to figure out what they were talking about. I mean, maybe somebody finally getting these religious leaders together to offer some kind of ringing denunciation of this endless cycle of violence in the Middle East or something of that sort. I read the caption and then the accompanying article. It turned out that they were gathered in Jerusalem at the behest of a fundamentalist minister from San Diego, California, a man by the name of Leo Giovanetti, who's a former lounge singer in Reno and Lake Tahoe, Nevada, but had gone to San Diego to start a church. It was kind of a mega church wannabe. It's not quite there yet. And the reason he had brought them all together was not for some sort of declaration about the importance of peace, or maybe to take a position on the wall that the state of Israel at that time was constructing to cordon off Palestinians, but rather to denounce a proposed gay pride rally in Jerusalem. By that time I was intrigued, so I went out to San Diego to visit Mr. Giovanetti. I arrived at his church on a Wednesday night, which is Bible study night at this church. And the text under discussion was the Sermon on the Mount, probably my favorite passage from the New Testament, when Jesus calls on his followers to be peacemakers, to turn the other cheek. He talks about blessed are the meek, care for the least of these in society, and so forth. And so I was very interested to see what Mr. Giovanetti would do with this. Somehow, in the course of 45 minutes, he turned those words of Jesus into a full-fledged rant against abortion and homosexuality. I still don't understand how he got there, but nevertheless he did. But that has been the real fixation by the religious right, actually those two issues to the present day. In the course of doing research for not this book, but the previous book, I went to Arlington, Virginia, right across the Potomac from Washington, for a meeting of a group called the Association for Church Renewal, which is a subgroup of another organization, a religious right organization called the Institute on Religion and Democracy. And the Association for Church Renewal is consists of the heads of the so-called renewal groups within American mainline Protestant denominations. So that within the Presbyterian Church and the Methodist Church, the Episcopal Church, there are these renewal movements, the very conservative renewal movements, as they style themselves, trying to bring these denominations back to a conservative position on both politically and theologically. And for a day and a half during that meeting, I was observing. I was really a reporter. I wasn't participating. All I heard was reports from these various denominations, and all they wanted to talk about was sex, particularly gay sex, decrying same-sex the ecclesiastical blessing of same-sex unions, and also the ordination of openly gay clergy. And report after report, and there was also kind of an overlay of triumphalism in all this rhetoric, because they were all saying, these will be the issues that will allow us to regain control of these denominations. There's going to be such dissatisfaction with these issues. Finally, toward the end of the meeting, I asked if I could ask a question, and they're very kind to me, at least till the book came out, they were kind to me. And they said, sure, go ahead. And I said, I'm kind of curious, how many people in this room have a theological objection to the ordination of women? And they kind of looked at one another, and it turned out one person, actually an Episcopal woman, said she had an objection to it. And they said, well, why do you ask? And I said, well, I have a fairly good idea that if this group were meeting 20, 30, 40 years ago, you'd be sitting around this conference table quoting Scripture to justify your opposition to the ordination of women. And what I was trying to get at, of course, was the historical contingency of biblical interpretation. And they said they didn't quite get it. And they said, well, what's your point? I said, well, what worries me about this conversation is that if I had been alive 60 years ago or 160 years ago, when the issues of the day were respectively segregation and slavery, would I be sitting at this conference table quoting Scripture to justify my support for segregation and slavery? Long silence. And somebody said, well, this is different. And I said, well, okay. How's it different? Tell me. It's just different, they said. And finally, after another excruciating pause, the moderator said, let's move on to the next report. There's something going on there. And I think in part of it is that as evangelicals began to abandon their denunciations of divorce, they did so in large part because the divorce rate among evangelicals was virtually the same as the larger population by that point. And they had to begin to locate sin outside of the subculture, at least, or so they thought. And that's why, in part, they've glommed on to those particular issues. Now, I promised to talk a little bit about church and state in the Baptists. I was one of the expert witnesses in the Alabama Ten Commandments case when, as you'll remember, Chief Justice Roy Moore plopped this 2.5-ton granite monument in the middle of the lobby of the Judicial Building in Montgomery, Alabama, at the same time steadfastly refusing any other religious representations in that space. If he had allowed that, nobody would have had a problem with that, but only the Ten Commandments. My testimony in that case, it's not original to me, this interpretation, but my testimony in part was that religion has flourished in this country precisely because of the separation of church and state. As the Baptist Joint Committee says, separation of church and state is good for both. And this is a quintessential Baptist principle because it goes all the way back to Roger Williams. And John will say more about this, I think, maybe next week, maybe not. And I always, when I give this account, I'm always, and John's in the audience, I kind of a little bit tentative about that because he knows much more about this than I do. But Roger Williams, of course, was a Puritan minister in Salem, Massachusetts, came to the New World in 1631. Very quickly, he discerned the dangers to the faith of too close an association between church and state. In his words, he wanted to cordon off the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world by means of, again in his words, a wall of separation between the two. His primary concern was the integrity of the faith. The Puritans, of course, were busy with their theocratic aspirations. And, of course, for his trouble, Roger Williams was kicked out of the colony, whereupon he went to Rhode Island, which the Puritans regarded as kind of a cesspool of religious heresy, and eventually started what is now Rhode Island as a haven for religious toleration and liberty of conscience. This is a fundamental Baptist principle. It's been with us throughout American history, at least until recently, and Baptists have been the champions, patrolling this wall of separation between church and state. Isaac Backus, John Leland, in the 20th century, George Washington Truett delivered this ringing speech from the steps of the U.S. Capitol in 1920, affirming these Baptist principles of liberty of conscience and separation of church and state. And what Roger Williams recognized, I think, is equally true today, that once you begin to conflate the two, once you begin to have, for example, prescribed public prayers in public schools, once you begin to plop these monuments in public spaces, ultimately it is the faith that is diminished, it's trivialized, it becomes fetishized. Some of you may remember that when Judge Thompson of the district court there in Montgomery ruled correctly that the Ten Commandments monument represented a violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, the workers were preparing to cart the monument away, and one of the protesters screamed, "Get your hands off my God." Unless I'm mistaken, one of those monuments on the side of that monument, one of those commandments on the side of the monument says something about a graven image. And that's the danger that Roger Williams recognized centuries ago. And so the leaders of the religious right are trying very hard to eviscerate the First Amendment, to collapse this distinction between church and state. And my counter-argument to these people is that you need to maintain it for the integrity of the faith. And I think that applies to the religious right more generally, and I'm going to draw to a close so we can take questions. My quarrel with the religious right, I have several quarrels with the religious right. My two fundamental quarrels is that I think they've distorted and perverted the words of Jesus, the teachings of the New Testament, something I consider lovely and redemptive. They've made into something ugly and punitive. They've also defaulted on what I consider the noble legacy of 19th century evangelical activism, which by my reckoning always took the part of those on the margins of society. And try as I might, I simply don't see that range of concerns reflected in the actions and the agenda of the religious right at the turn of the 21st century. I think they have diminished the faith. I'm not arguing that people of faith should not make their voices heard in the arena of public discourse, not at all. I happen to think that the arena of public discourse would be impoverished without those voices. But I think there's a very real danger to the integrity of the faith when it is allied with a particular political movement or political party, or as in recent years with a specific administration. Because at that point, the faith loses its prophetic voice. My sense of American religious history is that religion has always flourished best at the margins of society and not in the councils of power. And that, I think, is the fundamental mistake of the religious right, is seeking after power. Let me give you an example of that. As I was finishing Thy Kingdom Come, as I was writing it, rather, I sent an email message to 8 religious right organizations. A very simple question. I wasn't trying to be querulous, wasn't trying to start a fight with anybody. I asked them simply to send me a copy of their organization's position on the use of torture. Now, if ever there's a moral issue, I think we have one there. Now, these groups have detailed positions, papers on everything from stem cells to same-sex, you name it. They've got position paper on everything. Out of those 8 inquiries, I received only 2 replies. Both of them defended the Bush administration policies on torture. I cite that as an example of how the faith gets compromised when it seeks after political power and political influence. And that, I think, is the fundamental mistake of the religious right. I could do a whole lot more. I'd be happy to talk about Mitt Romney and JFK and where we are now in terms of the religious right, but I promised to stop and leave time for questions, so I'm happy to do that. Thank you for your attention. Please.
Could you say a word about how you came to leave the evangelical and move into the more mainline Protestant?
Yeah. The question is asking me to say more about how I came to leave the evangelical movement and move more into mainline. I still consider myself an evangelical, but I'm an evangelical Episcopalian. And I'm always careful when I talk about that to say, that I don't, as you should know by now, I don't line up with the religious right politically by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, part of my mission over the last few years has been to say, if you are a follower of Jesus, at least from my perspective, that's going to point you toward the left of the political spectrum on most issues, and I believe that with all my heart. How did I become Episcopalian? Well, the short answer is Trinity Church, right here in town. I wandered in one day and I felt like I'd come home. It was just it was a wonderful experience. I sometimes joke I'm Episcopalian today as a reaction to the aesthetic deprivation of my childhood, which is largely true. I also got tired of the cult of novelty. And if you're not familiar with evangelical worship, I'll need to explain that. Among evangelicals, there's this big push to try something new all the time. And they also talk about what they call the worship experience. I mean, that's help me. And I decided let's try something old this week. So I find a lot of comfort in the gorgeous cadences of the Book of Common Prayer, the rootedness with tradition and history, the communion of saints, to put it in theological terms. That's a short answer to your question. To give you a full answer, I'd probably have to lie prone on the couch for a while and really explore this. Yeah. Please.
Can you explain more about why the religious right turned away from Jimmy Carter and embraced Ronald Reagan, who was not?
Yeah. No, the question is, can I explain a little bit more about how the religious right turned away from Jimmy Carter? Just by way of background, as some of you may remember, Newsweek declared 1976 the year of the evangelical. Of course, Carter was campaigning for president that year. Also, Chuck Colson, the Watergate felon, had written this book called Born Again, which was quite popular. I actually think that Newsweek was 4 years premature. I think the real year of the evangelical was 1980. When you had not one, not two, but three major candidates for president, all of whom claimed to be evangelical Christians. Jimmy Carter, the incumbent, John B. Anderson, a Republican congressman from Rockford, Illinois, who actually grew up in the same denomination, or who was part of the same denomination where I grew up, called the Evangelical Free Church of America. In fact, I worked for Anderson in 1975. And Ronald Reagan, who also claimed to be an evangelical Christian, who probably had the smallest purchase on that title of all three of those candidates. The turning against Carter, to be honest, I'm still trying to figure this out. My next project I'm leaning toward doing a biography of Carter to try to figure it out a little bit more. More and more I look at it, the more and more I'm persuaded the reason was political rather than religious. And what I mean by that is that the real motivation was from people like Richard Viguerie not motivation, the real push was from people like Richard Viguerie and Paul Weyrich, who were using these evangelical voters for political gain. And they were able to persuade a lot of evangelicals to turn radically against Carter. Carter didn't help himself. I mean, certainly was unpopular by the end of his term because of the Iranian hostage situation, the Arab oil embargo, and high interest rates and so forth. And And as Adam Clymer recently wrote in the New York Times, the Panama Canal Treaties, the renegotiation of the Panama Canal Treaties cost him a great deal of political capital. That all factored into it. The other variable was in 1980 he conducted the White House Conference on the Families in fulfillment of a campaign pledge he had made in 1976. And the organizers of this event, Carter kind of kept his hands off the whole thing because he was busy with other things, including campaigning and the Iranian hostage situation. The organizers of this event, the event turned out had a rather capacious definition of what was a family, including single-sex unions, as well as single-parent families and so forth. And that, the leaders of the religious right turned that against him. But also Reagan was very, very cagey and very good at picking up on this. I argue that probably the turning point in that campaign occurred down in Dallas, Texas on August 22nd, 1960 at an event called the Religious Roundtable. Organized by the Religious Roundtable called the National Affairs Briefing, which consisted of preacher after stem-winding preacher getting up on the podium and decrying the moral decay in American society and so forth. And then Reagan gets up. Reagan had been coached extensively before this event. He got up with this famous line, which I think is probably the turning point of the campaign. He said, I know this group can't endorse me, but I want to know that I endorse you and what you're doing. Brought the House down and probably settled the election in 1980. In terms of Reagan, in this book, I keep putting down here because the book's here, God in the White House, which is my publisher, by the way, is doing its best to keep the book a secret, so I'm trying to push it where I can. What I argue is that over the past half century, with the single exception of Jimmy Carter, who actually sought to govern according to the moral principles he articulated in the campaign, with the exception of Carter, a candidate's declaration of faith and religious affiliation has virtually no relationship to how he governs, how he behaves in office. Reagan is a good example. There are many examples, but Reagan's a good example. Reagan claimed, as many of you remember, that the defining moral issue of our time was abortion. He vowed to make abortion illegal. Even his most partisan defenders, even now concede he made no serious effort to outlaw abortion. And what I found especially telling in the course of researching for that book was that in Reagan's autobiography, over 700 pages, the issue of abortion, which he claimed was the defining moral issue of our time, appears not once. I'll let you interpret that the way you want to, but I think I know how I interpret that. Please.
I think everyone here has heard about Obama's speech today.
Yeah.
Do you have any perspectives on it?
Yeah, I didn't hear the speech. I heard just a couple of clips on Obama's speech. I'm really not prepared to comment on that. I think you have to understand that, and apparently one of last week's lecturer talked about the whole tradition within the African American church, and I think you really, to understand the whole Jeremiah Wright thing, you have to take that into account. The African American church being the only venue historically where these sorts of sentiments are expressed. Black preaching tends to be hyperbolic many times, incendiary rhetoric and that sort of thing, and that's part of the whole tradition. I don't think it's fair to blame Obama for this rhetoric. As I said the other day on an early show or something, I've been going to church more or less for the last 53 years. If I believed everything I heard from the pulpit, I'd probably be in analysis for the next 20 years. I don't think that's entirely fair. And I think we're asking the wrong questions. That's the problem here. And this is really the argument of the book. What if? What I want to know from our presidential candidate, if we persist in asking questions about a candidate's faith, let's pay attention to the answers first of all, but also interrogate the claims. And what I haven't heard from any of the three remaining candidates is how their faith, which they're all trumpeting, McCain can't decide if he's an Episcopalian or a Baptist. Maybe I know too much about that. I've never been confused about that, but yeah. I did an op-ed piece a couple of weeks ago trying to help him figure out where he was. I mean, if there's a praise band, it's probably not a Episcopal church. Thank God. I want to know how a candidate's faith affects or informs his or her policies. For example, what if, on the eve of the Iowa precinct caucuses in 2000, when George W. Bush declared Jesus was his favorite philosopher, what if someone had followed up? Governor Bush, your favorite philosopher calls on his followers to love their enemies and to turn the other cheek. How will that affect your foreign policy, especially in the event of, say, an attack on the United States? Governor Bush, your favorite philosopher, expressed concern for the tiniest sparrow. Will that sentiment have any resonance in your environmental policies? Governor Bush, Jesus called on his followers to care for the least of these in society. Is that going to affect your welfare policies or your attitude toward the graduated income tax? I think those are all legitimate questions. Now, there are answers to those questions, but I think it's fair when candidates make these pronouncements to interrogate the depth of their understanding and how those principles are going to affect their conduct in office. A wonderful anecdote, again from this book, sorry, I won't have you wave it anymore. In the 1960 campaign, this relates to church and state, so this is okay, all right. In the 1960 campaign, I read across a letter in the JFK Library up in Boston from Billy Graham to John F. Kennedy, dated August 10th, 1960. Very kind, cordial letters you might expect. And Graham says, Dear Senator Kennedy, there have been a lot of rumors that I intend to raise the so-called religious issue in this campaign. And I'm writing simply to assure you that I have no intention of doing that. I'll probably vote for Nixon, who's been my longtime friend, is no secret to anyone. But I'm not going to raise the religious issue. 8 days later, Graham convenes a meeting of Protestant ministers in Montreux, Switzerland, for the purpose of discussing how they can deny Kennedy's election to the presidency in November. And the follow-up of that meeting was another gathering of Protestant ministers, 150 Protestant ministers at the Mayflower Hotel on September 7th, 1960, right after Labor Day, the start of the fall campaign. Again, to discuss the dangers of electing a Roman Catholic to the White House. And in the press conference, and this gets back to your question, at the press conference afterwards, the two of the ministers involved in the meeting, one was a man named Harold John Ockengay from Park Street Church in Boston. The other was Norman Vincent Peale, pastor of Marble Collegiate Church in New York City. Had a press conference in which they were telling the press that we're really concerned about how the effect on American democracy if a Roman Catholic ascends to the White House. And finally, toward the end of the press conference, one of the reporters asked, well, Richard Nixon, his opponent, is a Quaker. Did you guys discuss how Nixon's Quakerism might affect his conduct as President of the United States? And Peale responded in what was, I'm sure, an unintentionally funny but remarkably prophetic comment. He said about Nixon and his Quakerism, I'm not sure he ever let it bother him. Please.
With regard to the religious right and some of the fundamentalists, there's been increasing evidence that some of their concerns are shifting.
Yes.
In the environment, for example.
Right. Yep.
Do you see this as possibly
Yes.
a move into perhaps a more...
The question has to do with what seems to be shifting priorities among evangelical voters and then having an effect on the religious right. I think that's absolutely right. I actually predicted that in the book, Thy Kingdom Come. I'm not often right about anything, so I like to kind of point that out whenever I can. For that book, I came down here to Princeton for a debate, maybe some of you attended it, a remarkable debate between Lee Silver and William Dembski, who's kind of the high priest of the intelligent design movement. And I wrote about that. It was a fascinating evening in its own right, but also suggested that on the environmental issue in particular, this may be the key for kind of loosening the hammerlock of the old line leaders of the religious right on evangelicals and evangelical voters. And I think that's beginning to happen. Part of it is a generational divide. People like Chuck Colson and James Dobson keep insisting that the only salient moral issues are abortion and same-sex unions, or they call it same-sex marriage. And a younger generation simply doesn't see it that way. And they recognize that global warming is not a hoax, as some of these old line leaders of the religious right insist. What I also find as I travel is that this younger generation of evangelicals simply is indifferent to the matter of sexual identity. They just don't care. And so I think there's a rift that is a divide that is beginning to become apparent. They're also, the issues they are concerned about are the environment. They're also concerned about issues of poverty, AIDS. Rick Warren out at Saddleback Church in California is certainly doing some good work in that respect and calling attention to that issue. More and more of them are calling into question the morality of the war in Iraq. Imagine that. Within the Christian tradition, we have centuries of thinking and writing about what is and what is not a just war. Is it a defensive war? Is the amount of military force used roughly proportional to the provocation? Is there a reasonable chance of success? Have provisions been made as much as possible to shield civilians from collateral damage? And nobody's persuaded me that the invasion of Iraq meets any of these just war criteria. A younger generation of evangelicals is getting it. I think they're also sensitive to the issue of torture. I mean, if you're looking for a moral issue, why we are not marching in the streets over this issue, to me, is beyond belief. I can't get my mind around it. But a growing number of evangelicals are beginning to sense that. I think the other thing that's happened is that some other evangelical voices are beginning now finally to be heard. Jim Wallace certainly has made a big splash with his last two books. People like Tony Campolo, Brian McLaren, and others are beginning to be heard. Amy Sullivan at Time Magazine are beginning to be heard a little bit on this issue, and that's beginning to change. So I think there is a generational divide. All of the leaders of the religious right are either in their 70s or honestly dead. Jerry Falwell and D. James Kennedy, but Pat Robertson, I caught him a little bit yesterday. I don't watch TV except when I'm traveling. In the hotel room last night, he's crazy. He's just, I mean, it's incoherent. Dobson, Colson, Robertson, they're all in their 70s. So, and it's not to say there's not a AAA cohort waiting to move into the big leagues. There is, but I think any movement, particularly religious movement, it's very difficult to pass on the mantle of leadership to the next generation. I simply don't think they're going to be quite that effective. Now, I've said this before about the religious right, and I may be wrong again on this one, but I think something is changing. Yeah. Please.
Yeah, along those lines, or at least in the context of those remarks, what do you think is likely to happen with the issue of abortion?
Yeah, the question is what's likely to happen on the issue of abortion. I try very hard not to be a cynic. I don't think cynicism serves any purpose, to be honest. But I have to say on this issue of abortion and the religious right, I'm edging towards cynicism. By my reckoning, from February 1st, 2006, when Samuel Alito was sworn onto the Supreme Court, until January 3rd, 2007, when the new Democratic majorities took control of Congress, the Republican religious right coalition controlled all three branches of the federal government. The chief executive, the majority leader of the Senate, and the Speaker of the House of Representatives all claim to be evangelical Christians and implacably opposed to abortion. And yet in that space of time, 11 months, they made no effort whatsoever to outlaw abortion. They did pass the Military Commissions Act, which validated the use of torture, but they made no attempt to outlaw abortion. Now, I find that curious. I'm beginning, the cynic in me, which I try to keep at bay, but the cynic in me says that these leaders, think that the abortion issue is far too politically valuable for them, and they don't want to resolve it. Now, that may be too cynical, but I'm beginning to wonder, because every 2 years, every 4 years, they know they can trot that out and get a certain percentage of the voters who are going to fall immediately in line on that issue. Again, that may be cynical, but I'm coming to that view. Please.
Last question, okay?
Okay, last question.
So this is a little more technical, I'm afraid we're getting. There are I've written some other books, there are maybe 4 tenets of evangelicalism. Scripture is the whole thing. Going to be a born-again Christian, going to witness your faith to the public, and you're going to get involved in politics, like the PTA, or do something where you go out there.
Yeah, I think the 4th, this is David Bevington from the UK. I think he also talks about what he calls crucicentrism, meaning the centrality of Christ as the 4th. But yeah, go ahead.
The second one is the one that interests me. The born again, the epiphany, the revelation, something. And when people ask you, where did you start? You said, oh, right over here in Trinity Church is where I got a big light bulb came on or something.
Yeah, I probably overstated that, but yeah, go ahead. Okay, so you want me to talk about conversion?
Why is it, I know you said you're cynical. I'm not sure that you had any light bulb to come on for your cynicism. But when you go into the faith business, it seems to me it's a touchstone in the evangelical. They say, oh, when were you born again?
Yes.
Oh, well, I was 5 years old, or something to try to identify.
Yeah. For most evangelicals, the conversion, let me back up. I usually define it with a 3-part definition. Evangelical is somebody who takes the Bible very seriously as God's revelation to humanity. On the basis of that, an evangelical believes in the centrality of a conversion experience, a conversion moment, which is what you're talking about. And third is the impulse to evangelize or to bring others into the faith. Although I usually qualify that by saying that evangelicals talk about doing that a great deal more than they actually do it, and more they hire professionals to do it for them. In the mega churches, you've got these, I think the last I checked, Willow Creek Community Church had 150 pastors, and some of them are evangelism pastors, outreach, and so forth. But the second one, the whole idea of conversion. For most evangelicals, you're absolutely right. Most evangelicals want to point to a specific, datable experience of conversion. And in evangelical circles, it is certainly the case that evangelicals often rehearse the circumstances surrounding their conversions. I was converted on June 17th, 1982. I was in the hospital about ready to go for surgery. My roommate read the Bible for me, and then I gave my heart to Jesus, was saved, born again. These are all synonymous terms. I've come to see, as I read the New Testament, that there are really 2 models for following Jesus, 2 main models. First, you have the Saul to Paul, the conversion on the road to Damascus. Saul being a persecutor of Christians, the early followers of Jesus, who becomes, of course, probably the greatest evangelist in all of Christian history. And this is one of those instantaneous experiences. I think the other example, and I've just come to this fairly recently, is Peter. Peter has a very different relationship. He's plagued with doubts. He makes all these grand protestations of faith, and then he reneges on them. He promises fidelity to Jesus, and then he denies him 3 times, rather famously. That is another model, and I think that for most liberal Christians, for example, liberal Protestants, would probably, if they had to choose, would gravitate more to the Peter experience, with the full expression of one's doubts and I believe, help my unbelief sort of approach. But evangelicals, you're absolutely right, typically talk about this as an instantaneous experience. What happens kind of sociologically or phenomenologically is that evangelicals trade these stories and they tend to exaggerate them rather dramatically, because the the more sinful and decadent your pre-conversion life, the more validation you have to the conversion. And so we're getting way off the subject here, but that's an answer to your question. So, yeah.
Okay, let's thank